have to make. And in particular, I look forward to these conversations to help me make more informed decisions. So, good evening, and welcome to this month's open house. Every month for, 23 years now, we've come together to take a look at some of the issues, opportunities, challenges, threats that are all about us as a community and as a Commonwealth. And tonight we're focusing in on elections, and quite frankly, I despair of the future of democracy in this country, given some of the challenges we're facing in our elections. And I felt that way even before Russia hacked our most recent national election. So some of the issues that I hope we get a chance to take a look at this evening that affect our ability to have free and fair elections, I'll just mention a few that come to mind. The Electoral College. Can't fix that at the state, but there are those who might argue that we shouldn't fix it at all. I don't agree with them. I think we should and need to fix the Electoral College. It's a vestige of a time that has long since passed. We have actually taken some steps to address the impact of that here in the state, as have people in other states. But it really ultimately might take a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. Very high on my list of problem children for the election system is the role that money plays, and the extraordinary expense in running for office, and the fact that because of the role that money plays, it's hard to argue that we have free speech right now. We have expensive speech. If you got the money, you can be heard. If you don't, you can't. That's not what free and fair elections are all about. The fact that you can't just go in and vote even though you're a certified citizen. So instant registration is something that we can and should fix. I made a list of some of these other things. You're going to hear a little bit from Greg in a few minutes about ranked choice voting, which has had different names over the years, but it's ranked choice voting is the term of art at the moment, right?
That's correct.
Something that we can do in the state, something that Cambridge has done and Maine has done, that would dramatically alter the role that our votes play on election day. And it's not insignificant that half of us don't vote, even in a major presidential election. So that tells me that civics education has failed completely, and that we do not only do we not have free and fair elections because of some of the institutional changes that we need to make, but we don't have an informed and engaged electorate those two are fundamental premises to the way we govern. And I think both are in serious jeopardy. So those are a couple of things that come to mind. And to help us with the conversation this evening, first I want to introduce Pam Wilmot, who's the executive director, is that your title? Of
correct.
Common Cause, and she's been in that role for eons.
No, impossible.
And is really one of the people that helps me and helps all of us frame some of the important conversations about the state of democracy. And not only is she extremely experienced as a Democrat lowercase d, she's extraordinarily effective with my colleagues in the State House and is well respected even by the 2 or 3 people who disagree with her. So Greg Dennis is with Voter Choice Massachusetts and is here in Massachusetts as part of a national campaign to give us what I think is one of the more important changes in the way that we do elections, is ranked choice voting. And in a minute I'll let Greg get into that a little bit more, but let me start with you, Pam. If you could, let me give you the microphone, make sure it's turned on. Walk us through my list, What did I not include in the list that I should have included? Tell us a little bit about what our options are that you would have us pay attention to.
So I think the list that you gave was pretty comprehensive. We talked about money in politics. We talked about election modernization. And under that, there's a lot of different things, and I can go into a few of those. We talked about the voting systems, which Greg is going to talk a little bit more about. One thing that I see on your list that you didn't mention is redistricting.
Oh, yes.
Redistricting
Why
is
would I not mention that?
very critical because it frames who you can vote for, and it has become quite the science. It certainly has been used for centuries to exclude people from the voting process, and it continues to do that today. So that's very critical. National popular vote, there actually is a state way of dealing with the problems of the Electoral College that we passed here in Massachusetts and recently passed in Connecticut. It's the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and the effect of it is the same as a constitutional amendment, but it still keeps the process in the hands of the state in terms of being able to reverse what they did. So it isn't a permanent change. It's something that the states control. That process is essentially that each state passes identical legislation saying we're going to give our electors the winner of the national popular vote in all 50 states instead of the winners of our own state. Like I said, the impact of this is the same as a constitutional amendment, but there's one caveat. It only goes into effect when a majority of the Electoral College signs on. And currently, the compact with Connecticut that just passed it finally last month, we passed it here in Massachusetts in 2010, is about 2/3 of the way to what we need to get it, which is 270 electors, and we're at 170, 180 or something like that. So a good reform. In terms of the number of people voting, that is a huge concern. And civics education, I think, only gets you so far. It's part of a culture. I think we've been in a culture war where part of our political spectrum has trying to turn people off to government, trying to make them cynical about the political process, cynical about any potential change. And so a chunk of the population buys into this and says, why encourage them? It only, if we vote, it just makes them think that they're more important. Of course, that's very silly and, viewpoint. We do in Massachusetts have a much higher turnout than that. But part of the problem is that we're one of the lowest countries in the developed world, where we don't register all of our citizens. There is you have to do a lot of actual work. And for us who live in the same community year after year, have education, it really isn't that high a hurdle. But when you move every 6 months and your life is unsettled and you have to go into city or town hall because you don't have a computer, and frankly, online voter registration just passed because Jay and I worked on it for a very long time, and it finally passed in 2014. So that was a long time ago. And you can't even do that unless you've already registered once or have a license at the DMV. So we have some legislation that is our top priority for this session, which is called automatic voter registration. There's a flyer in the back that describes a little bit how it works. There's also a sign up, by the way, down there. If you're not on the Common Cause email action alert list, please sign up there. Automatic voter registration is a new idea, and it is kind of taken the country by storm. The first state to pass it was Oregon. We now have 13 different states, and basically it says when you go to a state agency, most states constrain that, and our legislation is just the Registry of Motor Vehicles and Mass Health. Mass Health is the largest social service agency and has a good technological capacity. and you give them all the information that you need to register to vote, that you are a U.S. citizen, that you're over 18, that you live in the state, that you're registered to vote. And you sign a document basically saying all that. You're automatically registered to vote unless you decline. So it changes that presumption from you have to do something to get into the system to you have to do something to get out of the system. The state of Oregon, which already had some of the highest political participation in the country, bumped up their registration by 375,000 people in the past 18 months since they've had their automatic voter registration going. Here in Massachusetts, there's 700,000 U.S. citizens who live here that are of voting age population and are not registered to vote. That's more than the population of the city of Boston. That is really unacceptable in this day and age, and automatic voter registration will help. It won't get all of them into the system, but it will get a lot more. Then, you know, people who are running for office can reach out and bring them into the process. I mean, part of it is when you're an unregistered voter, you're invisible to candidates and to political campaigns. And this makes people more likely to vote. So in Oregon, for example, when in the first 6 months, they at that point had only registered about 220,000 people, but 100,000 of them voted for the first time. So 100,000 new voters. That is more than the voting population of any city in Massachusetts other than the city of Boston. So that's a pretty good reform. We're trying to get it over the finish line, and Jay knows how hard that can be. It can
Sad
take,
but true.
Good ideas are not enough. One other thing I would just mention really quickly is in the area of money and politics. You know, Common Cause has toiled for many, many years to try to get big money out of politics, and we've won many, many different victories. Some of those victories have been taken back from us, even when you get them over the political finish line, which is hard enough because the elected officials are the ones that benefit from the current system. They don't really want to change it. Our Supreme Court has come in and then said, no, sorry, you can't do that because money is speech. Now that's shorthand for a longer legal argument. But the long and the short of it is they have created loophole after loophole after loophole so that now things that we worked hard to pass, like contribution limits, mean so much less than they used to because of Citizens United and Buckley v. Vallejo, which means all this money is coming outside of the system. There will be a question on the ballot this fall that will ask people to approve a citizens commission to sort of it's really more of a statement that we need to change this, and will create an ongoing conversation about it in our state and how to do that properly. We've run ballot questions all across the country. We've done resolutions, but ultimately that is a constitutional amendment. There's no other way to do it. There is one other tactic to get there, which we can talk about, but I'd rather not at this moment. But ultimately, it is a constitutional amendment that has to happen. And that means not just Massachusetts. That means red states as well as blue states. Both, you know, it does poll well there. I believe I've gone on probably longer than you wanted me to, so...
No, that's great, and we'll welcome your thoughts and questions about any of those. It occurs to me that neither one of us mentioned early voting and or online voting, which is
well, online voting is not, you know, we're not technologically ready to do that. There's a whole wide range of election modernizations that we need to do. We could get into those details, but I thought I'd wait for people to have questions about.
That's fine. Early voting is something, if you're traveling, you should be able to just go in a week before and vote, right? You, in fact, can do that here in Lexington because the clerk allows it. But there's nothing in statute that forces her to do that or encourages her to do that.
Well, actually...
Actually, we did pass.
Yes. That was part of our bill that we...
But except it's true, it's not true for every office yet.
It's not. It's only true.
And it's not true in the primaries.
It's only true in the general election.
Right, it's not true in the
state
primary.
In the general. It's not true in the primaries. although there is legislation right now that was approved by the Senate to have it for this primary that is coming up. It is in the supplemental budget. So if you want to weigh in the speaker about that, I've already talked to the conferees. I already talked to the conferees.
Greg, talk to us a little bit about ranked choice voting. I think it's on.
Hello? All right. How many people have heard of ranked choice voting before? Oh, wow. Okay.
I
This
am
is
lucky.
a
I have really educated
knowledgeable
constituents.
crowd. Well, you'll get to hear about it again. Sorry. So ranked choice voting is a simple change to the way we vote. In most elections today, in the voting booth, you pick one candidate. Under ranked choice voting, you are allowed to rank the candidates in order of preference. First choice, second choice, third choice, and so on. This solves a very big problem with our elections today, the problem of vote splitting and spoiler candidates. Maybe in the past you've wanted to vote for an underdog candidate, but felt you might be throwing your vote away on someone who can't win, and your vote may be better spent on a candidate with a chance to win, a front runner. Or maybe you felt like voting for a front runner, but you were concerned that there was a spoiler candidate in the race that might take votes away from them and cause them to lose. So our system today, because of this problem of vote splitting and spoilers, it discourages candidates from running to begin with. It pressures voters to vote for the lesser of two evils, and it elects candidates that fall short of a majority of support, with less than 50% of the vote. Amongst the many elections we've seen where a candidate won without 50% was the presidential election in 2016. Ranked choice voting fixes this problem. Your vote stays in play through the counting process until one candidate receives a majority of the vote. It will allow for more voices and choices into the election process. It will also decrease some of the negativity we're seeing in campaigns today. And I can go into some of the reasons why that's the case. And, as I said, it will ensure the winner will have a majority of the vote in the final round. That's an overview of what it is. It's used in many cities around the United States. And the state of Maine in 2016 became the first state in the nation to enact it for state and federal offices. And they're going to be using it in their primaries next month. So that will be a historic event, very exciting. And our organization, Voter Choice Massachusetts, is looking to do the same thing in Massachusetts. Bring ranked choice voting to state and federal elections in Massachusetts. We're also in favor of it at the local level, and we see some movement there and have a few victories there as well. So it's very exciting. Pam talked about automatic voter registration. In many countries around the world, you are registered to vote. You're not really registered to vote. You can vote by virtue of being a citizen. You are a citizen, therefore you can vote. There's no distinction. And also many democracies around the world, most democracies around the world do not use our sort of primitive voting system of vote for one in these single-member districts. They use fairer forms of voting. And I think that's one thing we have in common is we're moving in the direction that most democracies have gone.
So let me just add that that issue is going to hit very close to home in this district. There are 5 candidates running for the state rep position that I now hold. One of them could easily wind up with 21% of the vote and be the winner. Ed Markey, our junior senator, was in, if I remember correctly, a 7-way primary. And if memory serves me well, he got 17% of the vote. That was enough to be declared the winner, and now he's in the U.S. Senate. So that system, this is not a comment about Ed Markey or about any of the candidates running for state rep. It's a statement about the state of democracy. I'm going to borrow one of these microphones and walk around and see what your questions and comments are. And you guys get to share one. Yep. Who has a thought or question? There you go.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you, Pam. Bob Peters, I'm a member of the Democratic State Committee from Lexington. With the interstate voter compact for national popular vote. Is there anything in the laws that the states are passing which would subsequently allow a legislature to change its mind after the November election and before the electors meet?
Always a good question. And in fact, there are about 7 different answers to that about why they can't do it.
I'm sorry, why they can't do it?
They can't do it, yes. One of them is the Constitution. The Constitution says the electors are picked on election day and not after. The second is federal law that makes that illegal. The third is that very few legislatures are meeting at that time. The fourth is it would require, in fact, none that I know of are. The fourth is even if they aren't meeting, that would require a special session, which usually means calling for the governor to call something in, which is very difficult. And then the final is that the compact imputes those numbers if that, you got through the last 4, the compact says it's not valid. So compacts are something that happen thousands of times. We're in many here in Massachusetts. Compacts for milk, for transportation, for low-level radioactive waste, for all sorts of things. And that mechanism is actually in the U.S. Constitution. And courts have actually upheld them and forced states to abide by their rules. The compact does say you can withdraw as a state, but not during a blackout period during the election year. You can only withdraw after the inauguration of the new president and during the non-election period. So,
Margaret?
Oh, I just was unclear about your use of the word compact. What does that mean?
a compact is a fancy name for a contract between the states. And that is something that, as I said, that is in the Constitution that allows the states to enter into these binding agreements with each other. It started from the very beginning of the Union and continues to this day. I think they've grown in speed.
I will move out of this corner soon.
He'll get to you. I went to a meeting months and months ago on ranked choice voting, and at the time they were saying they were aiming for the 2020 ballot. Is that still the plan?
Yes, we're still looking at a 2020 ballot question.
Okay. The other thing is, do you think, I mean, I would hope that it might inspire more people to vote, because they might think that, you know, because of the reasons that you said before about why they don't vote. Am I being realistic about that?
Yeah, I think so. I also want to say that we do have we've had a few bills in the State House, including your esteemed representative here was the lead sponsor on one of the ranked choice voting bills. Will it inspire more people to vote? Anecdotally, we've seen that. So in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, for example, their last municipal elections where they used ranked choice voting had some of the highest turnouts that they'd ever seen. Santa Fe, New Mexico just had their first mayoral election using ranked choice voting, had one of the highest turnouts they'd ever seen in a mayoral election, with a lot less negativity too. Their last mayoral election had a lot of mudslinging, a lot of negativity, and one of the things we see in ranked choice voting campaigns is that candidates are incentivized to reach beyond their base to pick up those second and third choices. If you've ever canvassed for a candidate, you know you go to the House. If you go to a House and you see you're canvassing for candidate A and you see a sign for candidate B, you say, oh, I'm moving on. I'm going to the next House because I'm never going to get that person's vote. With ranked choice voting, you go to that door and you have a conversation and you find common ground with that voter. And you say, well, if my candidate can't be your first choice, maybe they can be your second because they have this in common. And it changes the whole conversation and makes it a lot more positive and a lot more issue-based. And that's also one of the big positives we're seeing around the country where it's used. So I do think it will increase turnout. We need to have more data in to be for certain on that, but I do believe that.
So I'll just take a quick crack on that. One of the reasons that Common Cause supports ranked choice voting is exactly what Greg mentioned with the negative campaigning. It's the only structural reform that I know of that really addresses that issue. In terms of turnout, I think there are some forces that kind of go in different directions because of the complexity. And I think over time in some of the areas we haven't really seen a big impact. Turnout is a very complicated issue that it has a lot of things that are involved. The most important being a competitive race. And that's something that ranked choice voting could have some impact on because it makes it less unitary. The other is actually how close the polling place is to you. And the third, believe it or not, is the simplicity of the ballot. And that is something that ranked choice voting kind of goes in there. So you've got some things that pushes in the right direction and some things that are a little less. But overall, I think it's a fantastic reform and we need to continue moving forward and trying these innovations. And we've been doing the same thing for many, many years. We're really stuck with a voting system that was established in centuries ago, and it's really time for a change.
Do either of you have a sense of where we stand right now with my colleagues? I mean, how difficult is it going to be to get us across the finish line?
Well, there's a reason we're going for a ballot question.
So I just want to interject a very strongly held prejudice. Almost without exceptions, I take ballot questions as an indictment of the legislature for its failure to act. So with some exceptions. The Fair Share Amendment is one of those, because we have to do it.
This first bill in? We put this
Oh,
in like 2003.
I'm not arguing that you shouldn't be taking it to the ballot. I know. I'm not arguing you shouldn't be taking it to the ballot. It just makes me really sad and angry that that's what we have to resort to.
Well, we had a couple bills. We had a bill that would enact it for state and federal offices, your bill. We also had a bill that would allow for a local option for cities or towns to use it, which is sort of less threatening. And the city or town local option bill did have a large number of co-sponsors. And, you know, if we put a lot of effort into it next year, we may see that actually go further than it did. We had a lot of people turn out to the State House. I think you should correct me if I'm wrong. There's a bit of a reluctance for a sitting legislature to change the system that elected them, both for maybe bad reasons, but also for good reasons, in that they don't want to see it either unduly benefiting themselves or unduly, working against themselves. So maybe the ballot question is sort of the right place for this anyway. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, I lived through the repeal of the clean elections law, so I've got
and Jay and
I've got the scars
in
to
that,
prove it.
but
right?
but for many years, elections are really a good kind of issue for the ballot for precisely the kinds of reasons that we've been talking about. It's very difficult to change the system that elected you. And we have been talking about, which we called instant runoff voting back in the day. Yeah. There was a very big campaign that we were involved in 2004. It didn't go very far at that point. And I think there's some misunderstanding about how it actually works. If you have a single seat with a ranked choice, it's actually very much of a centrist system. But if you have many seats, like a parliamentary election, or even 10 seats like Cambridge, it's the opposite effect. It's a they call it full inclusion, but what it means is that, you have lots of smaller viewpoints that are represented. So the impact is very, very different, and I think that's something that's very difficult to get your head around.
So, thank you for okay. So I have a comment and a few questions. One is that there's no perfect voting system, since Kenneth Arrow proved this in 1950, and that every system is subject to, there's an incompatibility of head-to-head winners versus voting on a lower choice. If you vote your lower choice candidates and reverse their order, you can affect the outcome. So although ranked choice voting may be better, how does it meet up in terms of transparency? How do you count the ballots? And does it allow for recounting?
Good questions. So how do you count the ballots? So it's, as was mentioned, has also been called instant runoff voting in the past, and it's counted like a runoff. So we start by taking all the ballots and just counting all the first choices. Each ballot is counted just to the first candidate on that ballot, just like we do today. And if any candidate has a majority of those first choices, more than 50%, they win. And the outcome would be, at that point, just like it is today. They win right away. The difference comes when no candidate gets more than 50%. And then we go to an automatic runoff. There are runoff elections conducted around the United States. In fact, many cities in Massachusetts have the preliminary general election where the top 2 go on, which is kind of like a runoff. In instant runoff and ranked choice voting, instead of having a 2-person runoff, you just eliminate the lowest vote getter, the last place candidate. If nobody has a majority, the last place candidate is eliminated. And everybody that had their vote counting who voted for that last place candidate first instead has their vote counted toward their second choice. So if you were a supporter, say, one of the key examples is the 2000 presidential election. If you were a supporter of Ralph Nader in the 2000 presidential election, your vote would count to Nader first. And if he came in last in first choices, which he would, right, he would be eliminated, and everybody that voted for him would instead have their ballot counted toward their second choice. And then we look again and say, does any candidate have a majority? If we don't, we just repeat the process. The last place candidate is eliminated, and people that voted for the last place candidate have instead their vote counted toward their second choice.
Is it manual or
It's automatic. That's why it's called instant. So it's all done. It's tabulated automatically, and the computer can tabulate it in seconds.
But that also gets to the second part of your question, which is
About-
we've got to be worried about fraudulent computers
Right.
or
Right.
fixed
So
computers.
the way a
And
lot of
we have-
jurisdictions.
I was going to say, we have here, we're kind of protected from that because the ballots get kept, and you can enshrine in law the requirement that ballots get kept and that there be recounts if there are any obvious discrepancies. Anyway, let me let you answer the question. So,
Well, yeah, exactly. We all need to be voting on paper. Every jurisdiction in Massachusetts votes on paper, either optically scanned paper or hand-counted paper. So there's always a voter verifiable paper trail there in case a question comes up for a recount or anything else. And we're fortunate in Massachusetts to all be voting on paper. We should also have audits every election year, after every election, like other states do. And Pam will speak more to that.
So that's an issue that Common Cause has been working on throughout the country and here in Massachusetts, voting security and having an audit that works. We actually did pass an audit as part of the comprehensive legislation that Jay and I worked on for many, many years. So we do have an audit, but it is only during the currently in the legislation presidential general. So we're hoping to switch that and to see that, given what happened with the last election, that really our system is vulnerable. In Massachusetts, we have some other protections. Our election database is only accessed through a dedicated T1 line. It's not connected to the internet in any way, encrypted or otherwise. Vote totals are called in. So it really isn't as vulnerable as some places. Ranked choice ballots can be counted by hand. They had been counted by hand in Cambridge for many, many, many years. Does it take longer? Yes, it takes a long time. Did anybody live in Cambridge back in the day? Yeah? It took like days, right? Or a week or something? Yeah, and some of the real audit people don't like ranked choice voting for that reason. Personally, I think that the trade-off is worth it. We're always looking at trade-offs when we do public policy. We do have the fail-safe of having those ballots, so we could audit them. It just is a matter of resources. And then also you could have a whole separate program that did it, even if you were doing a ranked choice. So I think where there's a will, there's a way, and we could do it securely.
Hi. In terms of ranked choice voting, one concern I have would be obviously for high profile candidates in high-profile elections. Making your decisions on ranking 1, 2, 3 might be relatively easy. But what about some primary, maybe there's 4 or 5 or 6 candidates? Does it force me or the electorate in general to be more informed, to be able to intelligently rank these candidates I might not know that much about?
Right. Did everybody hear the question? Okay. The question was, so in a high-profile race, it may be easy to rank the candidates, but in a lower-profile down-ballot race, it may be harder for a voter to know enough about the candidates. So first of all, ranking is always optional. You can just vote for one candidate if you only want your vote to count for that candidate. You don't care about the rest, or you have no opinion about the rest. It's always optional. You rank until you don't want to rank anymore. So we're always getting sort of strictly more information from the voters. We're never getting less information. So if you have a 5-candidate low-profile race today and people are going in and voting one candidate, if they do that, if a large number of people just vote for one in a ranked choice voting election, well, that's no change. But if some do vote second, third, fourth, et cetera, you're getting more information. Does it encourage voters to learn more about the candidates and be more informed about the issues? Yes, and I think that's a good thing. As one of the mayoral candidates who lost in Minnesota and Minneapolis said, he was a big fan of the system, but saw it in action and really liked how it played out despite the fact that he didn't win, said, you know, some people say ranked choice voting makes voters think. Well, I kind of like when voters think. So, I think it works, and we're getting more information from the voter either way.
I'll come around.
Concerning elimination of the Electoral College or the equivalent, there's one concern that I have about that. Thinking back to the election of the year 2000, the election ultimately was decided by fewer than 200 votes. Now, the fact that the counting was abruptly stopped, that's a separate matter, perhaps.
Actually, it was 5-4, as I recall, that election.
That election was 5-4, yes. What concerns me is if the vote nationally is extremely close, and you have, let us say, a difference of 1,000 between the two top candidates, how can you effectively have a recount? I think the logistics of that would be essentially impossible.
So there's actually an answer to that, too. And by the way, if you're fascinated by this subject, which I am, it's really just very interesting. There's a website called nationalpopularvote.com and a free book you can get from them that's about this big that has thoroughly researched with all the answers to these questions. So that 200 vote margin is, in fact, a consequence of the Electoral College. The actual margin in that election was huge. It was not the same as the current election, but it was initially 500,000, and I think it went up to 700 or something. So close to 1 million votes. If you look at small jurisdictions, like a school district race, they frequently are ties because they're small. The bigger the jurisdiction, the more those changes are magnified. Florida is a big state, and that is very, very, very rare. California has never had an election that's been within the margin of recount. Because it's so big. And nationwide, we have never been anywhere close to that. So what happens under the current system is that the Electoral College doesn't help small states, it doesn't help big states, it helps these states that happen to be artificially equal just by between Democrats and Republicans, just by the vagaries of demographics. And it gives then enormous power not just to those states, but to the election officials that can exclude or include voters and then potentially sway or close down the election machines like they did in 2004 and go into the black box and nobody really knew what happened. There was a lawsuit that's still pending over there on that. there's tremendous incentive to steal votes because you might have a difference of 200 votes causing 10% of what you need to win. Versus in the national popular vote, you literally are talking about millions of votes, and how you add that number up is really very different. So the actual mechanics of how you would do a recount is the same you would do a recount anywhere else. Each jurisdiction stands ready to do that. They have their own people. The rules are different in each state. Some states you have to be beyond a certain margin. Some states you do it as a matter of right. And that is true. We don't have a national election, even though we're voting for one candidate that is going to be our president for all citizens of the United States, all residents of the United States. I think it would spur Congress to perhaps put some, minimal thresholds on some of those kinds of things, which would probably be a good thing. But I think, as I said on the question about auditability and ranked choice voting, you're always going to be balancing some of these issues. And no other election in the world is held like we do ours. The rest of the world thinks we are absolutely nuts. Why don't you fix this? This is crazy. It's anti-democratic. Why is the person that gets the most votes not the winner of your election? It also has all sorts of other policy implications. You have twice as many disaster declarations in battleground states. You have something like 3 times as much money allocated to those states for similar kinds of incidents. You have, if there's a water rights dispute or something, presidents taking the side of the battleground state. You have visits and campaigning happening from day one. It's just the nature of the political process. Let's make it something that works for everybody and have a national popular vote.
Okay. Let me just ask, there are a number of questions left. If we can keep questions and answers as brief as possible, we should be able to get to everybody.
Hi. Now I'm talking, I wrote something, sent it to Boston Globe. They didn't print it. We always assume there will be an election. What if there won't be? And also, Tom Steyer relies on Congress to impeach Trump. But another way would be, which actually I've discussed it with different people. Somebody in Lincoln told me, the Democrat, he told me I should go to jail. And this is what I sent to, I'm working on it. I need your constitutional attorneys, I hope. You can, I have to fix it. The thing is this, suppose there's a war and there's a martial law and then no elections. I mean, it happened in Egypt. I'm not done.
Okay. Well, I want to get an answer.
No, I'm not finished. This is my suggestion. Every state, every neighborhood association, every village, every hamlet, they should meet and vote on 2 things. First, declare election of 2016 illegal. That way you get rid of Pence also. And then the second, vote that Obama, Carter, Bush, and all of them, they will be running the country until the next election. And the third, I don't want to put that in, and we have Nuremberg trials, and for people who would look the other way, and the punishment would be life imprisonment.
So what about the prospect of an election being canceled? I guess that's the first part of your question. Right. And then Bijan has essentially rewritten the Constitution to allow us to decide things differently. So reactions?
Yeah. A constitutional amendment, a new constitutional amendment, when the government is not by the people for the people, it's by the Congress for the Congress and NRA.
Yeah.
Okay. Pam?
No. If the elections were canceled, even in a state like New Jersey, when we had the hurricane, and New York, remember that?
Yeah.
They still carried on, Yeah, Hurricane Sandy. I think it would be very difficult in this country to really just fully cancel election. That is good. I agree. We do need constitutional amendments. We need a lot of change. But one of the things that I do all the time is we balance what is achievable with what is desirable. So we all have our dreams about if we had a magic wand, what we would do to make our democracy better. But we actually have to work together and to get it through the system. So Common Cause both tries to work on the big vision and then also the achievable goals that we can actually get through. And it's always that balance of doing it.
Okay.
So gerrymandering has been a hot button issue of mine for a long time. And I always assumed that if we could just get politicians out of the process into like a nonpartisan body, that we could find a solution. But the more I learn about the problem and potential solutions, it doesn't seem to me that there is an obvious solution. And in particular, I understand that with the passage of time, people are self-segregating more where they live. Liberals are tending to congregate into urban areas, conservatives into rural areas, and it makes it very difficult to come up with fair districts. So do you know if there are obvious solutions out there that if we could move
It
to?
depends on how you define
Great
the
question.
problem. Citizens commissions like we have in Iowa, Iowa is just more like nonpartisan, but Arizona and California most recently are very good redistricting processes. Are they perfect? No, they're not, because redistricting does deal with competing goals. What's more important, having your community together or having political competition? These are ideas that people can legitimately disagree about, and you cannot have a computer program just do it. There has to be people involved in the process, and people disagree. There are lots of different variables that we have to balance when we do redistricting. That doesn't mean there isn't a floor by which we should not go and that there's a real problem. So looking at the North Carolina maps that were just redrawn, or Pennsylvania, or Texas, where the redistricting process is intentionally used to disadvantage different groups. Or here in Massachusetts, where in the 2001, when our Speaker Finneran, is a lot of times was specific political payback for specific individuals. It wasn't political parties.
Really?
It wasn't racial, well, actually there was racial groups involved as well, and they lost a Federal Voting Rights Act. But again, it was all centered around individuals. Those are illegitimate reasons for redistricting, and we can put procedures in place. That's one thing independent commissions do. The legislature actually did a very good job last time around. It was actually the most transparent bill that has ever gone through the legislature in my tenure here in Massachusetts, and that's a very long one, unfortunately. But they really did a terrific job. And part of that was because they knew that if they screwed it up, they would get an independent redistricting commission, that would succeed. We ran a big campaign for that in the 2000s, came very close to succeeding. And they knew if they messed it up this time that they would get the power removed from their hands. But they showed that they could actually do it and do a good job. So hopefully they'll do the same next time, or eventually we will go to the gold standard, which is an independent commission.
A couple of things. When Maine voted in for national and state elections, did that also include local elections?
For ranked choice voting, no, it didn't. It
Interesting.
included state and federal elections,
Okay.
primaries and general elections.
I have
There ended up being a constitutional issue
Yeah.
with state general elections. But the others, state primaries, federal primaries, and federal general elections, there's no constitutional issue, so they're going forward with those.
So just,
Okay.
if I can piggyback on that, Maine also has clean elections.
They have clean
And
elections.
that's for state offices, if I'm not mistaken? So the legislature and statewide offices.
And Portland, Maine also uses ranked choice voting for their municipal election as well.
I have a related question. We've talked about turnout. I'm wondering if anyone knows whether the turnout is any different between cities proportionally for their local elections as compared with town meeting communities and their local elections. Our local turnout in an adjoining town here was unbelievably low for our local election. And I'm quite concerned about how that can be addressed or understood, and I'm wondering if there's any data comparing cities and towns proportionally and the whole process. Because here we are possibly adding many candidates, and the challenge for any voter is, first of all, to care, secondly, to turn out, and thirdly, to know the candidates. And I am concerned about how they will truly get to know and vet who the legitimate, hardworking, appropriate candidates are and are not.
Yeah. Well, like Pam said earlier, turnout involves a number of factors that are hard to measure, but competitive, high-profile races are probably the major driver of turnout. And cities are going to have some of those competitive, higher-profile mayoral elections when they happen are going to drive turnout more than I think you'd probably see in a town. And a multi-candidate race, yes, the voter has to assess all the candidates, may want to assess all the candidates, but each candidate is also going to draw out their own base and bring their voters to the polls. So that can have the effect of increasing turnout as well. Did you want to add to that, Pam?
Yeah, I would just say some of the academic studies are very interesting, and they show that we suffer from election fatigue. Too many elections spread out of too many different times, too many different levels of elections, and if they were consolidated, that people would participate at much higher levels, and we are unique in the world in that kind of multi-layered effect. We have floated some of those proposals at the legislature. They have not been particularly popular. And part of that is that, for some electeds, they like low turnout. Some of them don't. It depends. And some of them also, again, is just this, if it got me here, then it's good enough. Or I don't want to share the spotlight with some other candidate that's running at a different time. So it's a high lift to change that. It would make a difference in turnout. The numbers on cities can be abysmal. They can be really the lowest of the low, actually more so than towns. If it is there's no high profile open seat mayoral thing driving it. But it's all idiosyncratic depending on socioeconomic issues, depending on who's running, all this, so it's very hard to make generalizations.
If you will permit a quick question, could you tell me who I should call, or for that matter, each one of us should call to make sure that House Bill 4320, automatic voter registration, gets voted on the next 6 weeks?
So the best thing that you can do anytime that you have legislation that you want to see go forward is to call your own legislator, and if they are somebody like Jay, tell them to go to the speaker to ask for the bill. You can write a letter to the editor, to the Boston Globe, to your local paper. You can tell your friends in other districts. But if you call the speaker directly, it's not going to have that kind of impact. The legislature is very much like a, sort of a, I don't know how to say it is
I'm wondering what's
very
coming here.
hierarchical, and with those at the top really paying attention to what they see as their team, and their team is not necessarily is their legislators, and
Well,
so,
a very small subset of their legislators.
so the more, but it's also particularly this, I think this speaker does have a general, will listen if there's a lot of people coming. So, just chipping away is the most important strategy. Media helps. Social media is always good. Get on Twitter. AVRNMA is our hashtag. We do Twitter storms periodically. I think that we have been making a lot of progress, and there's a good shot of getting it done this session. Especially we're going to do it soon.
So I think, Pam has, I would say, disproportionate impact on the Speaker and the House and Senate leadership because of her years of service and the way she has operated. So I think that if we have a chance of getting this across the finish line, it's in part due to the work that you have done this year and this term and for many years before that. The other thing you could do is, if you have any friends in Winthrop, and Quincy, the majority leader and the Speaker are disproportionately empowered, and if they can be swayed, they can probably be swayed at least as much by their own constituents as they can by those of us who serve with them. So they'll listen to their own constituents.
Yep, that is true.
I think we're about out of time, but let me ask each of you, if you would, in about a minute or so before we have to wrap, if there were one thing that you wanted me to do this term, what would it be? And if there were one thing you would want my successor to focus in on, what would it be?
Well, it's ranked choice voting, obviously.
Yeah. What more could you do for ranked choice voting that you have not done? If you want to be more vocal about the prospects of a ballot question and talk that up amongst your colleagues, I think that would be a lot of value to us.
Okay, and then if we don't get that done, then that would be your priority for my successor in any event.
Yeah. Continuing on, refiling your bill for ranked choice voting for state and federal offices, and your successor's co-sponsorship of the local option bill as well, and ideally not simply co-sponsoring or sponsoring, but really championing it and going to the mat for it.
Yeah. By the way, when those of you who are having conversations with the candidates for the office, make that distinction. That's a very important distinction. It's easy to say, "Oh yeah, I'm for that." The question is this one of your? Will this be one of your top 3 priorities? Is the more telling question. I hate getting asked it, but Pam. That's right. That's right.
Well, automatic voter registration is our priority for this session. Mm-hmm. So I know you probably already spoke to the Speaker, but if you haven't, please do. I think for and it actually is late in the session, so new ideas are not going to be going forward. There's a sort of set things that are going to go. There's also some stuff on early voting, potentially some net neutrality stuff may be moving, civics education. All those are good democracy things that may.
That will happen this term.
Yes, that will. So. And I think automatic will as well, but we still need more oomph behind it. But I think for your successor, I would say there's always a tension between being right and having a vision, remembering where you're coming from, and being being effective. And you have to keep both of those things in mind. You have to be a team player, but you can't forget your values. And weighing those two things are very difficult and important. Be a part of the team. Don't fall on your sword for everything. Even if you back here might get a little pissed off at him or her. As long as they really are, Jay's been good at doing this. Be effective and make democracy reform a top priority, but do it smart. Do it well. Listen to what, we all want change and we all want it fast, but it doesn't really work that way. And there's always an inside and outside strategy. We have people on the outside that are calling for the constitutional amendment that nobody else has thought of. We need those visionaries, but then we also need our people on the inside that are pushing as far as they can and are actually getting our things done. And I hope that your successor is as effective, and who knows? Maybe the next speaker.
Maybe more. So I really want to express for all of us my appreciation for the work the two of you do. It is absolutely essential for the survival, if not the revival, of democracy. And that holds true for your participation in these forums over the last 23 years. I'm enormously grateful. Come next month, June 21st, for a debate between the 5 candidates who are running to represent you for the next 2 years. So they'll be here on the 21st. Come with your questions and hopefully an open mind. And thank you for being here tonight.
And if they can't make that one, on May 31st, they're all going to be at the Democratic Town Committee at Church of Our Redeemer, the same 5. So we have 2 opportunities.
Great. You may want to take advantage of both of those. Good night. Thanks for being here tonight. Thank you.